The first thing my neighbor said to me was, "Take that camera down, or you're going to regret it." And the strange part was, I had installed that camera because I was tired of feeling unsafe in my own neighborhood. I never thought a small security camera pointed at my driveway would turn into a fight that would end with a courtroom, a technician exposing the truth, and my neighbor realizing the one thing he thought would destroy me was actually the thing that proved he was wrong. My name is Daniel Harper, and before all of this happened, I was just a regular guy trying to protect my home in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. I had lived there for almost 9 years. It was the kind of place where people waved when they drove by, where you knew which house had the best Christmas lights, and where everyone complained about the weather but secretly loved the small-town feeling. At least, that's what it used to feel like. Then things started changing. Over the course of a few weeks, several cars on our street were broken into. At first, everyone assumed it was random teenagers passing through, the kind of thing you hear about and hope never happens to you. Then one morning, I walked outside, opened my truck door, and immediately knew something was wrong. My glove compartment was open, papers were scattered everywhere, and someone had gone through my vehicle while it was sitting 10 feet from my front door. It happened again later that month. Nothing major was stolen, but honestly, that almost made it worse because it meant someone had been there, touching things, looking around, and I had no idea when it happened. Then my neighbor across the street had his catalytic converter stolen right out of his driveway, and that's when I finally decided I had enough. I wasn't trying to build some high-tech security fortress. I wasn't trying to spy on anyone. I bought one simple camera, mounted it on the side of my house, and aimed it toward my driveway. The view showed my front bumper, the walkway leading to my door, and a small piece of the public sidewalk. That was it. Before I even turned it on, I stood outside with my phone and checked the angle myself. I wanted to make sure I wasn't accidentally pointing it somewhere it shouldn't be. I wasn't interested in seeing my neighbors' lives. I was interested in seeing who was walking up to my house at 2 in the morning. For the first week, everything was completely normal. The camera recorded cars passing by, the mail carrier dropping off packages, and even a neighborhood cat that seemed to think my driveway was his personal highway. I actually joked with my wife that the cat was probably the most suspicious thing the camera had caught so far. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I was watering plants in the front yard when I heard someone shouting my name from across the street. It was my neighbor, Marcus Bell. Marcus was the type of person who always seemed to have a complaint ready. He wasn't a bad guy, but he had this habit of assuming he was right before he knew all the facts. He walked across the street holding his phone in his hand like he was carrying evidence in a trial. Before I could even say hello, he pointed toward my house and said, "Daniel, we need to talk about that camera." I looked over and said, "Sure, what's going on?" He didn't lower his voice. "You're recording my family." I honestly thought I had misheard him. I looked back at the camera, then back at him. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Marcus raised his phone and said, "That thing points straight into my yard. You think I don't know what you're doing?" I remember feeling confused more than angry at first, because in my mind, I had done everything right. I had checked the angle. I had made sure it wasn't facing his property. So I calmly explained, "Marcus, it doesn't point at your yard. It points at my driveway. The fence blocks everything else." But he wasn't interested in an explanation. He had already decided what the story was. He stepped closer and said, "You have 24 hours to remove it, or I'm calling the police. And honestly, after what you've done, I think you owe my family compensation." I laughed a little because I thought he was joking. Then he said, $2,500 for emotional distress. That's when I realized he was completely serious. At that moment, I still thought this was just an angry neighbor having a bad day. I thought maybe after he cooled down, we'd have a normal conversation and clear things up. I was wrong, because 1 week later, I opened my mailbox and found an official notice from the city. Marcus had filed a privacy complaint against me. He wasn't just arguing with me anymore. He had made it a legal issue. And standing there in my driveway, holding that letter, I had one thought running through my mind. I bought a camera to protect my home, but somehow I was the one being treated like I had done something wrong. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince Marcus with words. I decided I was going to let the facts speak for themselves. The next few days were honestly some of the strangest days I had ever experienced, because suddenly, something that had started with a simple conversation about a camera became the main topic of every interaction in the neighborhood. People I had known for years would stop me while checking the mail or walking their dogs and ask, "Hey Daniel, what's going on with Marcus?" And I hazed that question because the truth was, I didn't even fully understand what was going on myself. I wasn't trying to win a fight. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I just wanted someone to look at the situation objectively and see what actually happened. But Marcus had already created his own version of the story. And once people start believing a story, facts sometimes have to fight their way through the noise. The first thing I did was review every second of footage from my camera. I sat at my kitchen table late at night with my laptop open, watching hours of recordings that were honestly pretty boring. A delivery driver dropping off a package, my neighbor walking by with his dog, cars passing on the street, leaves blowing across the sidewalk. Nothing exciting, nothing invasive, nothing that matched what Marcus was claiming. But I watched anyway because I needed to be absolutely certain. I needed to know that there wasn't some mistake I had missed. After several hours, I found the same thing over and over again. The camera never crossed the line. Not once. It never captured his backyard. It never looked through his windows. It never recorded anything private. It showed exactly what I said it showed. My driveway, my walkway, and a small section of public sidewalk. I saved every file, created copies, and even printed screenshots from different angles. I also contacted the company that installed the camera and asked if they could send someone out to inspect the setup. I knew this wasn't just about being right anymore. Marcus had turned it into an official complaint, and I wanted everything documented. A few days later, a technician named Evan Price came to my house. He was the kind of guy who looked like he had fixed everything from broken security systems to complicated office networks. He walked around my property quietly, studying the camera mount, the fence line, and the angle of the lens. After about 15 minutes, he looked at me and said, "Daniel, I don't know how this became a dispute, but this camera physically cannot see what he's saying it sees." Hearing that was a relief, but it also bothered me because I still couldn't understand why Marcus was pushing this so hard. Then I remembered something that happened a few months earlier. Marcus had wanted to install his own outdoor lights along the side of his house, but our neighborhood association had told him he needed approval because the fixtures were visible from the street. He was furious about it. He complained that everyone was controlling what people could do with their own homes. I never got involved, but I wondered if maybe this wasn't really about the camera. Maybe the camera was just the excuse. Maybe he saw it as another chance to prove that nobody could tell him what to do. A week later, we went to the hearing. Marcus arrived looking completely confident. He walked into the room wearing a suit and carrying a folder full of documents like he was preparing for a major legal battle. I have to admit, seeing him that confident made me nervous for a moment. Not because I thought he was right, but because I knew how quickly a false accusation could spread. Marcus stood there and explained his side. He told the officials that my camera was pointed directly at his property. He said his family felt watched. He showed screenshots from his phone and claimed they came from my security system. He spoke with so much certainty that if you didn't know the truth, you might have believed him. When it was my turn, I didn't try to make some dramatic speech. I simply said, "The camera is there because of crime in our neighborhood. It records my property and public space. It does not record his." Then my attorney asked Evan to explain the technical side. And honestly, that was the moment everything started changing. Evan connected a laptop to the display and showed the room exactly how the camera worked. He explained that it had a fixed lens with a 110-degree field of view. He explained that the mounting bracket had physical limitations and couldn't tilt upward or sideways beyond the position it was installed in. He pulled up a diagram showing the exact recording area. The line stopped before it reached Marcus's fence. It wasn't a matter of opinion. It wasn't about who sounded more convincing. It was physics. The camera couldn't do what Marcus claimed it did. But then Evan did something that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. He looked at the screenshots Marcus had submitted. He zoomed in on one image and paused for a moment. Then he said, "There's something important here." Marcus immediately leaned forward like he thought he was about to prove his point. Evan pointed at the image and said, "These pictures did not come from this camera." The room went quiet. Marcus frowned and said, "What are you talking about? Those are from his property." Evan shook his head. "No. Look at the distortion. Look at the light pattern. This is not a camera recording. This is a reflection." He explained that the images were actually caused by sunlight reflecting off Marcus's own windows. The glass was creating distorted shapes that looked like they came from another angle. The very evidence Marcus brought in to prove I was spying on him wasn't evidence from my camera at all. It was a reflection from his own house. I remember looking over at Marcus in that moment, and for the first time since this started, he didn't look angry. He didn't look confident. He just looked confused, like he was watching a story he had written fall apart in front of him. The person who had walked into that room believing he was about to expose me suddenly had to face the fact that his own assumptions had created the entire problem. And the strangest part was, I didn't feel victorious. I felt disappointed, because this whole thing could have been avoided with one simple conversation, one moment where someone asked a question instead of making an accusation. But Marcus had chosen a different path, and now everyone was about to hear the final decision. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after Evan finished explaining everything, and honestly, that silence was louder than any argument Marcus had made that day. You could feel everyone processing what had just happened. A few minutes earlier, Marcus had walked into that hearing carrying a folder full of screenshots, a confident expression, and a story where he was clearly the victim. But now the story had completely changed. The evidence he brought in to prove I had invaded his privacy was not evidence from my camera at all. It was simply light, glass, and a misunderstanding that he had turned into something much bigger. I remember looking over at him, expecting anger, maybe frustration, maybe even another argument. But what I saw instead was something different. He looked embarrassed. Not the kind of embarrassment where someone admits they made a mistake, but the kind where someone realizes the room no longer believes the story they walked in with. The official reviewing the case looked through the documents one more time, then checked the technical report, and finally looked back at Marcus. He calmly said, "Based on the evidence provided today, there is no indication that this camera violated anyone's privacy. The device is recording the homeowner's property and public areas only." Then he paused for a moment before adding, "However, filing a complaint based on inaccurate information can have consequences." It wasn't said in an angry way. There was no dramatic speech, no raised voice, no attempt to embarrass Marcus. But somehow that made it hit harder, because the truth didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be clear. Marcus sat there quietly, looking down at the papers in front of him. The same papers he had carried into the room like they were going to destroy my credibility were now just a stack of pages proving he had jumped to conclusions. He gathered everything slowly, putting his screenshots back into the folder one by one. I remember thinking that maybe this was the moment he would finally say something. Maybe he would look at me and say, "Daniel, I got this wrong." Maybe he would admit that he had reacted too quickly, but he didn't. He simply stood up, walked past me, and left the room without saying a word. And strangely enough, I wasn't angry anymore. I had spent days feeling frustrated, wondering why someone would attack me over something so simple. But watching him leave, I realized the biggest problem wasn't the camera. The biggest problem was that somewhere along the way, we stopped talking to each other like neighbors and started treating every disagreement like a battle. When I got home that afternoon, I sat on my front porch for almost an hour. I looked at the street, the same street where people had lived peacefully for years, and I thought about how quickly things can change. A few weeks earlier, my biggest concern was whether someone was breaking into cars at night. Now my biggest concern was defending myself against someone who lived across the street. It was a strange feeling because, technically, I had won. The complaint was dismissed. The facts were on my side. But there wasn't this huge moment of celebration that people imagine after a victory. There was no music, no cheering crowd, no feeling that everything was perfect again. Instead, there was just a quiet realization that something between neighbors had been damaged. A week later, I installed a second camera on the other side of my house. This time, I did something differently. I added a bright sticker right underneath it that clearly said, "Security recording, public area only." Some people might wonder why I bothered after everything that happened. Why give someone like Marcus even more attention? But I actually saw it differently. The sticker wasn't for him. It was for everyone else. It was my way of saying, I'm not hiding anything. I want people to know exactly what this is and why it's here. And surprisingly, after that, nobody complained. Not Marcus, not anyone else. The funny thing is, after all the accusations and the tension, the neighborhood actually became more comfortable with security cameras. A few neighbors even asked me about the setup because they had experienced similar issues with car break-ins. One neighbor told me, "Honestly, after what happened with Marcus, I realized I probably need one too." I laughed because that was the last outcome I expected. The thing that caused so much conflict ended up helping other people feel safer. As for Marcus and me, things were never exactly the same. We weren't suddenly best friends. We didn't start inviting each other over for dinner. Some situations change the way you look at someone, and this was one of them. But over time, we reached a quiet understanding. We could walk past each other on the sidewalk. We could say hello. We could coexist. And maybe that was enough. Looking back, I still believe privacy matters. I believe people deserve to feel comfortable in their own homes. But I also believe accusations carry responsibility. Before you point a finger at someone, before you decide you know their intentions, you have to be willing to look at the facts. Because sometimes the person you think is crossing the line isn't the person causing the problem at all. Sometimes the real problem is the story we create before we know the truth. And that's the part of this whole experience that stayed with me the most. It wasn't the hearing. It wasn't the complaint. It wasn't even the camera. It was realizing how fragile trust can be between people who live only a few steps away from each other. So now I'm curious what you think. Was Marcus someone who had a legitimate concern but handled it completely the wrong way? Or do you think he was looking for a reason to challenge me from the beginning? Have you ever had a neighbor situation that started small but turned into something much bigger than you expected? Share your experience in the comments, because these everyday conflicts are often where the most interesting stories come from. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to share it with someone who loves real-life drama, unexpected twists, and moments where the truth finally catches up. Because at the end of the day, arguments can be loud, accusations can spread fast, but facts have a way of waiting patiently and eventually speaking for themselves.